Our next speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Benca, is a research associate at the University of California Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley. Here's a fun bit of internet history in my life. Their Museum of Paleontology was among the first 50 websites ever created. Or it wasn't the website, it had a website. It was one of the first 50 ever created. And I saw it back in May 1993 at Cornell, which gives away both my age and my longstanding fascination with both tech and paleontology of all sorts. I first encountered Jeff through the podcast In Defense of Plants, in fact, episode 406, where he discussed ancient plants. He's an experimental paleobotanist and professional horticulturalist, pioneering the cultivation and conservation of early diverging plant lineages. Jeff is also an artist and a National Geographic Explorer, partnering with a society to illuminate and protect our world through science, exploration, education, and storytelling. He even appeared on Nova, which is like every geeky kid's ultimate dream. Jeff's research spans both fossilized and modern plants to better grasp environmental factors behind mass extinctions. His beautiful Instagram showcases remarkable photography and art. The plants he specializes in are lycophytes, ancient spore-producing plants, including club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts. Their ancient relatives towered as trees during the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago. They form coal, as I understand it, they remain with us in this strange way. Modern lycophytes still exist, but like princess pine and ground cedars found in New Jersey's forests, they're smaller and notoriously challenging to cultivate, even by experts. Don't try that at home, is my recommendation. And also, one thing that has happened is they have been decimated over the years by people collecting them for holiday wreaths. Don't do that either. They take a very long time to grow. So with that, anyway, that's a little bit about what Jeff is going to talk about, and I'm very, very excited to uh, turn the conference over to Jeff.
I will start here. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Jeff Benca. Sorry for the technical difficulties earlier today. Um, so today I'm going to be talking about botanical dinosaurs, New Jersey's native lycophytes. So a little introduction to myself. I'll breeze over this. I basically am a time traveling botanist. So I'm a paleobotanist and a paleoecologist, and also do work with modern plants as a professional horticulturist in past life, at least. I still do a lot of actual horticulture today, growing all sorts of plants and backing up rare plants for botanical gardens all over the United States and the world. A lot of my work focuses on basically trying to figure out how plants respond to major environmental events in the past. So I use integrative sorts of studies between basically the fossil record and also experiments on modern plants to reconstruct their responses to environmental stresses to figure out what happened during mass extinctions. Today, I won't really be talking about the extinction aspect, but more about basically the lycophytes that we have of North America. And a good portion of this talk will be sort of time travel in a way, talking about the past lycophytes that have also, many of them, been in North America, but sort of globally, to give a better idea of how we can sort of appreciate these plants. So I'll start out with, what are lycophytes? Where did these plants come from? How have they impacted our planet? And then kind of move on to the present to talk about some of the lycophytes you may see in New Jersey and botanical dinosaurs that maybe we can all grow and enjoy. So I'd like to start with basically the land plant tree of life here. As we can see, there's bryophytes to our left. These are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And then the rest of these plants are what we call vascular plants, or tracheophytes. Now, I have vascular in quotations here because mosses, liverworts, and hornworts have all evolved tissues for moving water and nutrients basically throughout their plant body. And so they are also vascular, but tracheophytes, or the true vascular plants, are all unified by having these what are called lignified tracheids. These are the water and nutrient basically conducting cells, the piping of the plant. in the cell wall of the vascular plants or the tracheophytes, you have a compound called lignin, which is very resistant to decay and helps in scaffolding the plant. So kind of like it has its own internal PVC pipe. Mosses and hornworts and liverworts, the bryophytes, did not evolve that, so unfortunately they don't get to be in this really fun club of a lot of these large charismatic plants that we see every day. So among the tracheophytes, there's two major groups historically that have been sort of thought of, and that is spore plants and seed plants. And again, I have quotations here because our understanding over time has changed of these plants. So spore plants, when we say spore plants, nowadays it's probably better to say seed-free or seedless vascular plants versus seed plants. And the reason that is that seed plants are technically all spore plants as well. All plants are spore plants on land. However, the seed is a very structurally modified and evolutionarily modified version of the seed, and pollen is a modified form of a very small type of spore called a microspore in a way, ancestrally. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll try not to get too much in the weeds, literally speaking, on that. Um, Now, while that's sort of the historical way of looking at tracheophytes, I'd like to introduce sort of a more evolutionarily, I guess, relevant way of looking at them. And that is that there is a great divide between all the vascular plants that happens very early in their evolutionary history. And it results in a major, huge group that is the euphylophytes here to our right. This includes virtually all of the major, like large plants that you see on the landscape walking down the sidewalk every day. It's going to be pretty much the manilophytes, which are the ferns and horsetails, the gymnosperms, the conifers, ginkgos, and cycads, as well as the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Now, I'd like to contrast that with this other group to the left, the lycophytes. These are going to be our, what I'm calling here lycopsids, which are just, that's a technical word just for the group that includes all the modern lycophytes. And there are three living families in this lineage today. We have the club mosses and the fir mosses, which I should say are not mosses. This is a misnomer. It's just common names. So please disregard the idea that these are mosses because they are far from it. So Lycopodiaceae is the family of the club mosses and fir mosses. We also have Selaginellacea, the spike mosses, which are also, again, not mosses. And then we have the Isoetales, the quillworts. And so Lycopodiaceae on the left, our club mosses and fir mosses, are distinguished from the other two major families or lineages here in that they have one type of spore. And the term used is homosporous. So one type, basically one size of spore. Whereas Selaginellacea and Isoetaceae have two types of spores. They're called heterosporous. Hetero meaning basically more than one or two in this case. And so spike mosses and quillworts both have a large type of spore called a megaspore, which is analogous to a seed and independently evolved in these plants, as well as a smaller type of spore called a microspore, much smaller that acts a lot like a pollen grain. Another thing I should bring up too with these plants is that while the Lycopodiaceae and the Selaginellacea, their members are terrestrial plants that have oftentimes a scrambling or sort of tufted habit sometimes with, these adventitious runners or shoots. The quillworts are very different. They're basically like compacted trees that you wouldn't know just looking at them. They oftentimes live underwater and in riparian environments, places that are just waterlogged soils. So they like to grow with wet feet. And they have a specialized photosynthetic pathway that allows them to do this. So they basically photosynthesize a lot like a succulent plant. However, they grow underwater. So like the total opposite. But the thing that really allies the two is that they basically breathe at night. They take in their CO2 at night when there's a lot of animals respiring and bringing out CO2. They live in these high mountain lakes sometimes, at least where I'm in the Pacific Northwest. where the water is carbon dioxide starved. And then they'll also be able to get some of that through their roots, apparently. So very strange plants, little squat tree, but it's called Merlin grass. So if you do go snorkeling anywhere, which is a really fun experience if you're looking for plants, you'll see just little tufted, what they call the quillworts or Merlin's grass, just coming out. You'll just see the leaf tips coming out of the mud, but underneath is a little squat trunk that is kind of woody called a corm. So when we talk about all these sorts of plants, they're allied by several major traits. The first is looking at their shoots and roots, which they have dichotomous branchings, meaning that they branch in twos. And there's two sort of flavors of this. You either can branch in equal pairs, like a tuning fork, which is called basically isodichotomy, or there's other terms for that. And then there's also another term where there's unequal dichotomies called anisodichotomy, I believe. Don't quote me on that one. But um, the second flavor of this, where you have unequal branching, oftentimes it's a little bit more like some branches on a deer's antlers. Um, the leaves in general on these plants are unusual in that they're called microphyls. So they basically are a very oftentimes small, minute, and uh, they're all single veined. So they have a single vascular strand that runs through the center of the leaf. There's a few exceptions to the rule. I think one in Mexico and one species in India out of hundreds. Uh, but the rest of the lycophytes that we know of today have one vascular strand in the leaf. And those leaves will look roughly like many like pine needles on some of the coniferous families. So in Pinaceae and Podocarpaceae, you'll find leaves that have basically this sort of architecture, but their leaves have evolved independently. So just about everything about these plants has evolved completely independently of the other vascular plants. Um, and the other thing that sort of unifies these plants is ancestrally is that they have sporangia or spore-bearing capsules that are arranged laterally with respect to the stem. So they're not terminal, they're not the top of the stem, but they actually come out of the sides of the stem. And many times these sporangia will be aggregated into fertile regions, or in some of these fertile regions that are really compressed, you can find them in cones called strobili. Now, those strobili can be arranged terminally, like at the tip of the branch or the top of the shoot, but the actual individual spore-bearing capsules that open up like little clamshells that are basically kidney-shaped, they will be coming out of the side of that. Uh, Lycophytes are extremely ecologically diverse for a plant group that many people have probably never noticed or seen, though you can sometimes find them, especially in hardwood understories of forests. You can get a good idea of seeing these electric green little what they were called ground pines or running cedars. Again, not conifers, lycophytes. Um, but you can find them oftentimes in trees growing epiphytically in the tropics, such as Phlegmariurus, this genus that's found across the tropics in South America, Central South America, Asia, and Australia. And you can also find many of the sorts of resurrection plants, these dryland spike mosses, growing in harsh deserts to arid landscapes where they seasonally will dry out and look dead. But then upon adding water, they regain turgor pressure and kick right back into growth to Isoetes, which you can barely see in this right image here, but we're trying to look through a mountain lake surface to see uh, basically a monoculture of these plants growing in basically this really barren habitat. And getting to that, another thing that's really unites these plants ecologically is that lycophytes are environmental stress tolerators, meaning they basically thrive in places that are challenging for many other plants to grow. Um, some of these sorts of environmental challenges involve the types of soils and substrates they live in. Many lycophytes are really specialists at growing in low nutrient, that is low nitrogen, low phosphorus sorts of substrates. Others can survive in almost poisonous soils with heavy metals being there. And there's even lycophytes out there that have specialized in superheated soils around volcanic steam vents called fumaroles. I've seen some of these where they'll send a runner that'll go maybe 10, 15 feet down basically a hot fumarole vent that's spewing out fluorine and chloride gas that basically poisons people and animals. And the only other thing you'll see growing around it is basically cyanobacteria and maybe a few mosses. So, why is it that they live and survive in these sorts of environments? Well, one of the reasons is that their roots are extremely specialized to take being very efficient at nutrient uptake. So if there's just any little bit of fertilizer, phosphorus, nitrogen, any other sort of trace metals, their roots are going to be able to take that up really easily. Very fast bonding affinity for that. They also do form these mycorrhizal associates, kind of like some of the parasitic and hemiparasitic plants. And they start out their life actually as parasites, some of them, parasitizing fungi like orchids we were hearing earlier. Um, Now, that said, with that sort of affinity for taking in low amounts of nutrients very easily, most lycophytes have very slow growth rates. So they don't really live life in the fast lane, most of them at least. They also are ecologically very poor competitors with other plants. So if they're going to germinate somewhere, they really need to not have much competition. They need to have sort of a open playing field. And so you will find them in places that are habitats where you'll have either frequent disturbance or basically those sorts of limiting factors. It's either too acidic, too much heavy metals, or too few nutrients for other plants to gain a foothold. The best place if you ever want to go looking for lycophytes in most regions of the world where they occur, which is pretty much every continent except Antarctica, um, you can basically do drive-by botany on back roads. So, like for instance, where I live in Pacific Northwest, if you go on a logging road and look at road embankments where you have just open exposed mineral substrates, and we're talking about like clay, silty, sandy loams. That's a lot of times where you'll find some of these lycophytes coming out of forest margins and loving the light. So many of the lineages actually are highly have a high affinity for high light environments. So they like a lot of sun. But there are some that are also specialized, the Selaginellacea specifically, like tropical Selaginella or spike mosses, that specialize in deep shade environments. Some of them even have the largest chloroplasts on the planet. I think they even came up with their own name for them, like bisonoblasts. Anyway, super cool plants and way too many tangents for me to get off of. We got about 400, I don't know, 415 million years to get through here. So speaking of which, really to appreciate these plants, you really have to understand their past, and where they've been, and maybe think of, your modern ones with a different lens. To do this, we have to go back in time to the times when lycophytes diverged from all other vascular plants. And this is right here, the early Devonian period. You can see that the continental configurations are completely different. The climate's totally different. We're dealing with an atmosphere with very high CO2 at this time. It is what paleontologists and paleoclimatologists call a hothouse world. Not a great place to be if you're a human. Going back even a little bit further in the Devonian, when lycophytes really had a lot of diversification, let's go back to the Silurian period, which is ends about 420 million years ago. This is a world dominated by invertebrates. So our ancestors were still figuring out basically how to develop a mouth, like basically the earliest fishes were diversifying by this point, and many of them were a little bit more like lampreys and filter feeders. Uh, and a lot of them were armored too, so they had weird exoskeletons. So they were basically like cosplaying invertebrates at the time. But there was a really good reason for that because there were, you could get 20-foot nautiloids, these giant nautilus, squid, octopus relatives that are predators patrolling the ocean. And then you've got like huge 6-foot sea scorpions that want to eat you. So you've got to basically armor up because you're on invertebrates menu at this time. On land, animals with backbones really are nowhere to be seen. We really hadn't figured out how to get here yet. And that said, it was even a really hard place for anything to live, basically. So at this time, plants were just invading the land, or at least starting to diversify on the land. And they basically had a whole bunch of stresses they had to deal with. So they had these poorly developed soils. So dirt basically had barely been born at this point. So most of the substrate things they're living on is mineral. It's clays and silts and things like that, but not with a lot of organic material. Poorly developed soil horizons. You have no shade, so shade hasn't been invented yet. Just think about that for a minute. Unless you're going in a cave or you're beneath a mountain or something, there are no trees, there are no leaves, there are no big plants. You have extremely intense ultraviolet radiation. You have a weaker ozone layer probably at this time too. So things are getting blasted with UV coming out of the water. And then you have very high CO2 levels to keep this really hot. Well, you'd ask why anything would want to leave the water at this point. It kind of sounds like Mars up there, or some, maybe not Mars, but another planet where it's pretty harsh. And it really was like coming to a new planet for plants coming out of the ocean. So land plants did come, and they originally descended from lineages of green algae, similar to the what we call the modern charophytes. So this includes modern coleochate and Chara and Nightella, if you're familiar with freshwater macroalgae. Coleochate looks like a little disc. You can find it on dead leaves, in water bodies all over. And it also is a frequent aquarium weed. So if you don't scrub your aquarium wall tanks of a fish tank, you'll oftentimes get coleochate, little green specks starting to show up. They're really cool under a microscope. As we can see, fossil representatives down below here, Parca decipiens is like a giant flapjack coleochate. You get a couple inches in diameter. And then many of these sorts of algae were already developing ways to disperse and live in fresh water, which was already a leap from salt water. And at that, they also had UV absorbing pigments like sunscreens that would allow them to live in shallow waters, basically ephemeral pools that would dry up, and they had sometimes hardened spores with also sunscreens too to survive that light. Well, in comes the earliest land plants. All the mosses, hornworts, and the liverworts, they basically are laterally spreading for the most part. They had no competition for light, so they just had to compete with each other in a clone world. So they had rhizoids, specialized hair-like cells that would go down into the ground to take up moisture, and they could basically just spread if they were in contact with at least seasonally moist conditions. Though there were many of these mosses and their allies the bryophytes that would have been dry adapted too, so resurrection type plants at this time. Um, they developed cuticles, which are basically a waxy coating over the plant body, at least over the reproductive structures on mosses. And uh, with a waxy coating, when you cover yourself and you breathe through your walls like an amphibian, like a plant does, you got to create pores. So they basically developed stomata, these little breathing pores that could open and close depending on moisture availability. So they could basically release water and heat, really important in a high CO2 world where it's really hot. Well, and over time, our friends, the tracheophytes, the true vascular plants, start to emerge in the late Silurian, and they basically have developed these lignified tracheids, so they have the ability to pipe water further than the mosses can. Most of the mosses, hornworts and liverworts, bryophytes, they have to move laterally, but these plants, these vascular plants, could now grow upward a lot more so. And with more of these robust sorts of piping, they could branch further than most of the mosses. So you see a lot of dichotomous branching, that is, branching in twos, and they would be able to get their spores higher up off the ground and catch the wind better, while also starting to semi-shade out their competition, many of the bryophytes. So now plants are jockeying more for light in the vertical realm, not just the horizontal realm, um, with really interesting, branching habits. Now, how do we know a lot about the stick world and the plumbing of these plants, these early vascular plants? Well, in Scotland, there's an incredible fossil assemblage that's called the Rhynie chert that was about 407 million years ago, excuse me. Um, it was an ecosystem that was very much like Yellowstone today, a hot spring ecosystem where you had hydrothermal volcanic activity that was creating these superheated geysers that would flood nearby surrounding um, wetlands. So there were basically like these marshlands around where all these stick plants were growing, and then they would get flooded in silica-rich, superheated water and preserved that way entombed in silica in 3 dimensions. And so we basically have three-dimensionally preserved plants at cellular level. Some of the earliest lycophytes appear around this time too, and that is the zostrophils. Now, zostrophils includes all of our modern lycophytes, really, probably technically, but the group that we often call zostrophils is extinct, all but extinct. These were leafless plants that really had spines called enations, and as you can see to the right here, they have these little sporangia that are arranged laterally with respect to the stem. And many of them had really cool coiled sort of growth called circinate vernation, which is similar to ferns and a little bit like some of the sundews, like the threadleaf sundews, even superficially. So you have these they branch like tuning forks. They got dichotomous branching, lateral sporangia, and weird fern-like growth. So these sort of zoospherules gave rise to a group called the Lycopsids, which are really the rest of the plants we'll be talking about today. I'll be calling them all lycophytes because they are technically lycophytes, but lycophytes as a term includes all these extinct zostrophils that were leafless. So in general, lycophyte roots were derived from underground shoots that we see in those other zostrophils as well. And so they basically were shoots that just grew downward, geotropically instead of negatively geotropically upward, like most other plants do toward the sun. These go down toward the dark. And from that, they develop these interesting roots that dichotomize, like tuning forks. So one of the key differences, these roots evolve independently in the euphylophytes multiple times in ferns and seed plants, and also completely independently in the lycophytes. So in lycophytes, the branching of the root always happens at the terminus of the root, the very tip, where it's dichotomously branching, so two, always in twos, right at the root apex. Whereas in euphylophytes, the root branches further back from the root apex laterally out to the side. The leaves also had to evolve in these plants. So again, we're dealing with leafless plants here. So basically green tubes for, millions of years. And here come lycophytes that basically this progression from some of the zostrophils to the modern lycopsids have the enations, those spines, are just basically like an outgrowth of the outermost tissues of the plant. And they eventually, there are plants in the Rhynie chart where you can see that the vascular system is actually extending the base of the enation and eventually fully vascularizing those leaves. We can see some of the representatives in the fossil record down below that actually exhibit these traits in this sort of fashion. The earliest potential lycopsids show up in the late Silurian, and the first one is Baragwanathia longifolia. And Baragwanathia was a total weirdo. This plant was gigantic. It was the size of basically a timber bamboo, and yet everything else on the planet at that point was about the size of a thimble. So if you imagine like this complete oddball suddenly appearing, fully formed leaves, fully formed roots, and gigantic in the fossil record, and everywhere else, all you see are micro little tuning fork sticks. You might be scratching your head as a paleobotanist. Where did this thing come from? Well, Baragwanathia shows up in what we call a precocious origin, meaning that it shows up earlier than expected in the fossil record, given how advanced the sorts of morphology and complex the traits are. And this is a really common thing. Also, if you want a sneak peek into the world of paleobiology, the study of ancient life, paleontologists and paleobotanists alike will oftentimes be publishing the earliest of a new, group of organisms. And after a while, if you're in the field, you get a little jaded because you know to expect if you're a paleobiologist that there will be earlier specimens out there than you can detect. And this is probably the case with Bragwanathia because the fossil record is extremely difficult to get into as a club. If you die and you want to be a fossil, it's a really, really high entry point. So you've got to basically, if you're an animal or a plant, you have to fall into a place that has basically either anoxic conditions, so no oxygen whatsoever, very high acidity or very basic conditions, so place with extreme chemistry, and or maybe really cold. So you want to basically be in a place where microbial decay is stalled. And if those prerequisites are met, you may be able to join the fossil club. But even then, there's all sorts of other things that can happen to, organs of a plant before it enters the fossil record. So at the end of the day, we're lucky to find anything in a rock. So the fact that this was preserved 420 million or about 420 million years ago or so, um, 415, is pretty remarkable because once you're in the ground, you also have volcanoes that can send out these like basically sills and lava sills into the ground and cook the rock and destroy you as a fossil. So it's a long time to hang out. Without further ado, another group of lycopsids that shows up very early in the fossil record is Drepanoficus. It's a genus of these zostrophyll lycopsid sort of early plants that have leaves and is also gigantic, but occurs in sort of Arctic Canada and a number of other places. I have a reconstruction down here to the right that I did a few years back for a press release on that one. Um, so moving on to the Devonian period, this is the age of fishes. This is when our ancestors really got cooking. You had fish taking over as dominant predators in the ocean, giant armored, basically bladed bone blade sort of fish like Dunkleosteus. And you have fish and the early forerunners to amphibians starting to move into fresh water and onto land even. CO2 levels are also super high right now. So it's really advantageous to have really tiny leaves, which lycophytes are great for because they've got those tiny needle-like leaves, but long millions of years before anything else figured out how to make a leaf, other than mosses, which it's not really the same kind of leaf. And what you have here is lycophytes basically had all sorts of different herbaceous like body plants that they would be able to diversify into. So they oftentimes were ground cover like ground spreading plants. So but many times those simple leaves would stay just needle-like. While that happens for most of those lineages, there were some lineages of lycophytes that developed these really complex prong-like leaves called the Protolipidodendrasians, if you want a word to impress people at the next cocktail party. Um, Protolipidodendrasians don't have a common name whatsoever, which is not fun if you're studying them. So one of the some work I did previously on these plants was trying to reconstruct and describing this new species of one of these lycophytes from very small compression fossils in the Pacific Northwest. And through basically figuring out how these leaves were inserted along the stem, it was possible to reconstruct the plant digitally through basically doing a lot of different renderings of leaves in different angles and then aligning them. And we found that these prong-like leaves almost interlocked and created a structure that was more similar to like an animal than a plant. It was almost more like a marine glass sponge, the way all the hooks and everything interlocked with each other. But I like to have this as sort of an example of when paleobotanists are trying to visualize what they're working with. I mean, we're one of the really fun things to be in this field is that you have to use your imagination a lot. And a lot of times we're not correct because we weren't there. We're using circumstantial evidence, but we're trying to reconstruct, it's a little bit like forensics. I mean, we're really trying to reconstruct what's going on in the past using circumstantial evidence. But when you do reconstruction, sometimes you can actually learn how the parts of an organism interact in a way that it wouldn't have been possible just looking at the two-dimensional flattened fossil. So moving to the early to middle Devonian, we get lycophytes that developed into trees. basically, the first forests. So these weren't gigantic trees. They may have been, pretty much maybe the size of a very small aspen or something like that. But lycophytes developed these anchor-like splaying root systems underground that dichotomized, branched in twos. And then they had a telephone pole-like dominant branch or shoot system that would extend upward like a spike for most of its life, and then toward the end of life, it would branch out into a beautiful dichotomizing canopy, and each branch tip would terminate in a spore cone or a strobolus. So really, reproduction is a one-time affair for these plants. They're a lot like salmon. They basically grow and bolt and eventually reproduce and die that way. Now, these sort of spore forests basically didn't form much shade still. So it was a very open canopy where there still would be a lot of opportunity for all of these ground-dwelling plants to spread. Going up to the Carboniferous period, we get a world that gets a little bit chillier. So as you can see now, there were glaciers and massive ice accumulation on the South Pole in what was called Gondwana. Now as supercontinent Pangaea has been forming, and we have a particular area toward the equator that is of interest. So this is a part of what's called Euramerica, which is now eastern United States and into Europe and a couple other places uh, that were joined at that time continentally. Um, this was an area that was basically became vast coastal, what are called coal swamps. These vast equatorial wetlands or mire swamps that were dominated by gigantic lycophytes. Some of these lycophytes, such as Lepidodendron, we'll talk about soon. These sort of coal swamps have been sort of they're famous for, if you're going to look at a time before the age of dinosaurs, which all of this stuff I'm talking about is long before dinosaurs ever appear, like hundreds of millions of years. The coal swamp is really the quintessential like alien landscape. There were dragonflies flying through and whizzing through these forests that would have been bigger than seagulls, and there would have been 6 foot millipede-like plants, or not millipede-like plants, millipede-like animals, called I think Arthropleura is one of the really famous ones that would have been trucking around like little trains in the understory. But you can see there's now a lot of the other euphylophytes have diversified. So there are fully leaved euphylophytes with large, what are called megaphylls, multiveined leaves. The conifers have already started to diversify, and their relatives, the gymnosperms and other seed plants, are around. And you have these massive, what look like tree ferns in this picture, that are actually called seed ferns. And they're actually seed plants that superficially look like giant ferns. But you can see maybe in some of the fern-like foliage that there's little ornament-like structures hanging off the terminals of each little frond or frondlet, and those are actually the seeds. They get even avocado-sized in some of these forests. But for the most part, the swamp forests were dominated by lycophytes, and these lycophytes would be growing with basically like 10 feet of water. So they're growing out of the water. They can get up to 160 feet tall, and their trunks could be 6 feet in diameter. And the really crazy part is that 6 feet in diameter would be at the base and at the top of the stem too. These plants would barely taper. And it actually is really challenging to reconstruct them and put them in a textbook because their trunks are so long versus their canopies that you basically would just go off the page a lot of times when you're trying to represent them. So this here is a very compacted, basically abridged version, squat version of a lepidodendron or a giant scale tree. And you can see that every organ of this plant was given its own genus name. It's very much like a Mr. Potato Head situation because plants shed all sorts of organs. And when paleobotanists are describing each of those organs, they got to give each organ a name before they find that they're all attached to the same plant. And Lepidodendron itself was actually thought to be a giant python before it was even thought to be a plant because of its giant scale-like texture you can see here in the reconstruction from the shed leaf bases. So it shed its leaf bases and across much of its trunk, and then the canopy would create a mostly shadeless canopy. Now, these trees, as they would die, would fall into these coal swamps and become buried. And over time, massive peat accumulations happen. So this water was probably very highly acidic, very low oxygen. There wasn't much decay going on. And that peat would eventually, through time, heat, and compression, become charcoal. And, well, not necessarily charcoal, but coal. And you basically would have a bunch of coal deposits in these sorts of ecosystems. In fact, most of the world's coal comes from this time and from this region, from these plants. So lycophytes, while basically taking up CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, were locking the carbon in their bodies, falling into these swamps over tens of millions of years in hundreds of thousands of year cycles, basically, of fluctuating sea levels, where the swamps would expand and retract with the sea level. And they would keep burying more and more trees in the ground to the point that it drove the world into the biggest ice age. These lycopods basically drove the world into one of the world's biggest ice ages in history. And that ice age threatened to actually end life as we know it on land, all multicellular life probably, because the glaciers from Gondwana's, the Antarctic region, would have encompassed the entire world into what's called a snowball planet. And when that happens, multicellular life goes toast. Now, how did we all survive? Well, thankfully, tectonics was happening, and thankfully, volcanoes were doing their job. The continents shifted, Gondwana started breaking apart, and eventually, it basically destroyed the ecosystem where these huge, amazing lycopsids were growing, and thankfully drove them into extinction, I guess, for everyone else's sake, but depressingly for me, growing lycophytes, because I'd love to see one of these things. So the age of the spore plant dominated forests ends, and basically most of those lepidodendrons go extinct, sadly. But it leads to the origins of many of our more modern forest ecosystems now become much more firmly established in both the highlands, where they were previously on mountaintops during the Coal Age, and also in the lowlands where those swamps used to be during the Permian period. So about 298 million years ago to 252. So back from our time travel, we're back to the modern day. Um, so through five mass extinctions, we again have three surviving families like Proteaceae, Selaginellacea, and Isoetaceae. And we can move into the groups of where these groups are in terms of New Jersey. So like Proteaceae, basically being homosporous, having only one type of spore, has quite a number of representatives within the state. So you can find club mosses, which are a common name for these ground pines, ground cedars, or running cedars. They all have scrambling runners, and the genera you can find species of in New Jersey are Lycopodium, Lycopodiella, Dendrolycopodium, and Diphasiastrum. These all got split off of Lycopodium before. Linnaeus described everything as being Lycopodium in this group, but there are now, I believe, maybe 16 or so genera now entirely in the family Lycopodiaceae globally. And they are very well established in terms of morphology and genetics, that they are very different and they have very ancient divergences. We also have the fir mosses, which are Hupersia, and the most common one that you'll likely see is Hupersia lucidula. For the runners, the most common ones might be Dendrolycopodium obscurum, used to be called Lycopodium obscurum, Lycopodium clavatum, the wolf's paw, and then Diphasiastrum digitatum is another one that you could find. Moving on to Selaginellacea, the spike mosses. These are heterosporous. They have two types of spore, megaspore and a microspore, analogous to a seed and pollen. And there are two species in New Jersey. So there are the meadow spike moss, Selaginella apoda. You can find these in shaded environments or in open wet meadows. Either suits them fine. They have very flattened leaves that basically are trying to intercept light in places where light is a stress. So they're kind of mimicking ferns in a way. Whereas the other species, the rock spike moss, Selaginella rupestris, or now I think has been broken up, Selaginella is a gigantic genus of spore-bearing plants that's been broken up into many genera as well recently. Uh, the rock spike moss belongs to, I think, a genus now termed Bryodesma. And Bryodesma as a group, as a lineage, are found in typically dryland environments. And they have spirally arranged leaves that are more classically similar to other lycophytes that you see, like the club mosses and their ancient relatives. So they have little needle-like leaves and they're resurrection plants. So they'll basically dry out during certain seasons, living in rocky sort of environments, and then they'll rehydrate and grow others. The last group that you can find in New Jersey are the Isoetaceae, the quillworts. And there's only one genus found there, Isoetes. And these are usually aquatic to riparian. They live in wetland environments and very nutrient-poor substrates, like almost nothing there. And underwater, they're also living in oftentimes CO2 starved environments. So these are some of the ultimate stress tolerators of the plant kingdom. They can switch their photosynthetic pathway depending on whether they grow underwater or whether they grow on land, and they'll change their leaf type if they do the same too. So it's basically like if you were to dive underwater and grow gills, and then if you came out of the water and you could ditch your gills or shed them off. So the underwater ones, some of them won't even have stomata or breathing pores. So there, a lot of the carbon dioxide and a lot of the respiration's happening underground in the roots. So why are most native lycophytes only seen in the wild? Well, because they're really hard to grow in a nutshell. They need those nutrient-poor substrates, so they do not grow in your garden center soils, and they do not do well with fluctuations in humidity and water availability, partly because they're very efficient at taking water up out of the ground, but their stomata, their breathing pores, do not respond very quickly or easily with fluctuating humidity. So if the humidity drops, they're drawing up lots of water and they're releasing a lot and they die really quick as the soil dries out. So they sadly need a very consistently moist place. Like seepages are common places you can find these things. And they're also, again, poor competitors if anything's going to shade them out, if it's a sun lover. Different if you're a selaginelle from the tropics growing in a gloomy rainforest understory. Those do great in tropical greenhouses just fine. And I should say, many of the tropical selaginella are definitely an exception to this rule. You can grow them. There's all sorts of ways to grow them. And if you're having trouble finding resources on them, feel free to shoot me an email or get in touch. I'm happy to geek out about this stuff all day. Um, so with that sort of question in mind, basically when I went into college, I basically was horrified to see that there was just no way to grow these plants because I kind of fell in love with them being a dino geek and already growing carnivorous plants and being fascinated by carnivorous plants. I started seeing that these plants often grow in these nutrient impoverished habitats alongside carnivores. And so I set out to try and figure out how to grow them and developed a way to grow a lot of our terrestrial native club mosses. So if you ever are wanting to try to do this, I will say it is very difficult to do without a climate controlled environment. But if you're ever doing research or want to do these sorts of things, feel free to get in touch with me. There are several papers I can refer you to as well. But I can say, just on an anecdote with that, the only way I found out how to grow these things was through killing them for several years and getting so mad that I destined one to die by throwing it in a pot of clay and leaving it for a year. And apparently, the greenhouse staff at this university unwittingly continued watering this tray and then called me about a year later, and I found that it was just covered in club mosses. So that ended up being sort of the spark of, oh, well, this is how they grow. Without further ado, let's talk about one lycophyte you can grow here in New Jersey that is native, and that is the meadow spike moss, Selaginella apoda. And you can grow this one in basically wet acidic soil. So something that's peaty works just fine. Garden soils are fine, and they act like annuals. So they'll spread spores, and those spores will germinate in the next year in the spring. So unfortunately, these are still pretty hard to come across. So if you're ever looking for a source of them, I do propagate it actually. I grow many, like thousands of little sporelings every spring. So if you ever do need a place to get them, you can ping me on that. There is one nursery that I know of. I think Plant Delights Nursery in North Carolina, run by Tony Abbott, that will sometimes have these available as well. So that's a great resource too. Um, yeah, but if you're interested in going on the odyssey of growing these really cool botanical dinosaurs, I encourage people to try and do that. But yeah, but be careful, and uh, many of these you can only get out of the wild, so it's very difficult to establish them in culture without harming wild populations. So it's usually not a thing to do. Without further ado, I'd like to give acknowledgments to everyone who has put up with my lycophyte obsession over the years, and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was fabulous. I have to say I'm pretty sure that certainly in recent years MPSNJ hasn't had any presentations where we started out with walking with the dinosaurs, and moving forward. But but very, very cool. Having propagated a lot of native plants in my life, some of which are very difficult. We have not tried to do the lycopodium, so I may be contacting you. But we do have a couple questions. Um, One that came in had to do with the problem with sort of the historical problem, actually, with folks foraging for these things. Going out the Christmas wreaths. You make your wreath out of all this stuff. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that at all? Just to sort of throw it out. We've touched on foraging a couple times today. I just didn't know if you wanted to mention that.
Yes, absolutely. Historic foraging for these plants has had pretty negative consequences for many of them. They're for the wreaths, there definitely seems to be a lot less of them. They're a lot harder to find. Habitat fragmentation itself is already really driving a lot of these into very marginal habitats. So yeah, I definitely do not recommend collecting them for wreaths or any sort of floral bouquets or anything like that, though they're beautiful foliage plants, and I mean the ultimate foliage plants in my personal obsession opinion, or whatever quirk I have for that. But they're great looking plants, but they are best left in the woods where you find them. One of the things I would bring up too for foraging too is that there are some lycophytes that are have been known for a long time to have medicinal value, and one of them being Hupersia. All the Hupersia out there, I believe, which are temperate, and many of them form gemmes, specialized reproductive propagules that pop out and can basically start a new plant clonally. Uh, Many Hupersia have an alkaloid called huperzine A, which is a very potent reversible was acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So it's used for actually treating early degenerative neurodegenerative diseases early, or disorders early. It's being screened as a candidate for potent Alzheimer's treatments, and it has been used for memory enhancement in China for since time immemorable. In
Mm.
China, they're nearly extinct because there's been so many generations collecting Hupersia for that. And the thing that's really scary is that these plants take about 15 years to grow an inch. And
Yeah,
so when someone goes in and collects every single one of them, I mean, you're talking, you might have, maybe another 15, 20 years that they're underground as sporelings, parasitically living with fungi before they even get to that stage of
yeah.
collection. So, yeah, major problem.
Thanks for that. Um, there was a question here which I'm going to mostly read. So this is from Thomas. He says, I'm doing some forest restoration on a property in the Adirondack Park in New York, basically removing Pachysandra and Vinca, ugh. In the neighboring hardwood forest, there are lots of beautiful Herpesia lucidio, and it's jumping around on me. Why is it doing that? And Dendroclypodium and Dendroidium. I would love to find a way to get club moss to grow in the area that's being restored. Is there a way to, from nearby, get it from here to here, because it's a restoration project and looking at a nearby population? Is there a useful way, a safe way, a good way to do that?
There is. So they can be transplanted. I have limited experience with doing it myself. I'm just starting to do it right now in my yard, finally. But I have had other people through social media reaching out to me, showing me pictures of they've been able to transplant things like Lycopodium clavatum. Dendrolycopodium definitely can be done too, and Hupersia will also transplant pretty well. The main thing is just making sure you're choosing a site that's right for them, so it has the right sort of shade characteristics for each of them respectively, and has enough moisture persistently. So I think it comes down to site selection. Some other things to watch out for are if if there's a lot of earthworms in the area and there's no longer club mosses around there or fir mosses, that could be an indication that it won't be suitable anymore. So like earthworms can actually change, European invasive earthworms will change the soil structure and they'll change the nutrient availability and actually will burn out the roots if you try and plant them. So if you're in a place where there's not as much of that impact, you still have a pretty good chance of transplanting them. But yeah, feel free to reach out if you're interested in looking a little more into that.
And obviously permission from the nearby population before you go out and try to move it into your restoration
Absolutely.
area.
Absolutely. Yes.
Just just one of those things we throw out periodically, you know. Um, Someone want to know cycads that grow in New Jersey. Are there any? Were there ever any? You know, what's the story with cycads in New Jersey? Um,
Psychas, New Jersey. Ooh, I
yeah.
actually don't know too much about the cycads, whether fossil cycads were in New Jersey. What I would think is if you have Carboniferous sort of assemblages, what happens is like in the fossil record, during that time, the coal age, where all of these giant scale trees were forming coal in eastern North America, you did have cycads at the same time living in uplands.
Hmm.
The main thing is many of them didn't enter the fossil record because they were in sort of hinterland environments at higher elevations where they were growing in drier habitats, not near water bodies. So I don't know too much about what fossils are there of cycads in New Jersey's past, or if the question was also dealing with growing modern cycads,
Well, I
because that's
think
a
they would,
different one.
if you've got modern cycads they can grow, I'm sure they'd be interested in that too.
Okay, yes, yes, you can, yes, you can grow modern cycads. Uh, Outdoors in New Jersey, maybe in the summer, but probably not the winter. So most cycads are really not frost tolerant. So you want to keep them out of that, and then you can bring them in the winter. They're great. They're great indoors as long as you've got a very bright light source for most of them. There are shade growing cycads as well, which have broader leaves. One of the easiest ones probably to start with are, I believe I think might be Dayun. There's several from the United States actually down in Florida. Zamia, sorry, it's Zamia is
Yes.
the genus, and those are very easy to get from many places, readily available in the trade, and you can test out your conditions with a cheap little Zamia and not worry about depleting anything. But yeah, keep them drier than wet if you're ever going to grow them. Best way to kill cycad is to keep it too wet. So put them in a cactus mix, high porosity, and give it watering only after it's fully dry, kind of like a succulent.
You know, the first time I encountered Zamias in Florida, I was very confused at what I was staring at that day, I have to
Yes.
say. And I really liked your dive into uh, the difficulty of becoming a fossil. Because we do tend to, I think if we don't think about it too hard, we tend to think about the fossil record as being much more complete than it really is, and the luck of the draw of actually managing to have you or some part of you be fossilized and then be found,
Yeah.
you know, is another part is really sort of interesting. And now my brain's just sort of going and thinking about the highlands of the New Jersey being covered with cycads anciently would be sort of an interesting thing. We do have another question here. How about Lycopodium tristaceum? Is that something that can be grown in similar conditions as in the previous question?
Yeah, so some of those, the Tristachium, I think they're now in Diphasiastrum now, but that group, Diphasiastrum, the ground cedars, they basically will live in drier sorts of substrates in the wild. So they oftentimes will be found in sandier, sandier, drier places. In cultivation, diphasiastrum are pretty difficult. It's hard to get that balance right of the soil being aerated and dry enough without the plant losing too much water. And the main reason for that coming into cultivation is that you'll be starting from a cutting if you're working with one of those plants. And by then, the roots are probably not going to be very big or have a lot of mass. So you basically have to keep the plant very humid for a good period of time, maybe a few months, for it to really root in. And then you take your humidity dome off and grow it in more ambient humidity, and you might have a chance then. But they can be very slow growing, Diphasiastrums particularly.
So last question. Um, I think you've intrigued several people here, just based on some comments that come by. Where can people learn more about this group? We asked Jason earlier about good books on fungi and mushrooms. Where can people learn more about this? I don't remember seeing a lot of field guides in your average bookstore on the lycopods, for example. Where would be a good place to send people to learn more?
There's that's a great question, and it's one that has troubled me for a while now. I don't I don't in terms of them, I can't think of any off the top of my head that are really geared toward lycophytes specifically. One thing to do is try and get as many sorts of fern references because lycophytes have, in my opinion, the heinous association of being lumped with ferns, ferns are great, but these are not friends of ferns. These are way more interesting than that and way bigger like division of the tree of life than that. It really belittles them. So like there, as far as I know, there's no singular treatment that's focused on lycophytes specifically. But what you'll usually find is that most fern books will be a guide to ferns and fern allies or ferns and lycophytes.
I'll
Many,
throw a bone to the lycophytes.
yeah, but so that's probably going to be your best bet. So any fern identification guides you can find, or ones that specialize like in, I think there was a neat one written, I believe, on like, yeah, there was a new treatment on ferns and lycophytes, either of North America or somewhere out east, I think. That was done. I think Emily Sessa wrote it, but I have to look up the title again. But that should be probably one of the really good guides that is very updated in terms of taxonomy, how these are all arranged and all that. But I can
Emily
have
Sessa. How do you spell her last name?
Sessa.
There we go.
Yeah.
So Emily Sessa seems like a
Yeah.
good place. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there and move on to our last speaker. Thanks so much, Jeff, for coming to speak on weird plants in New Jersey, um, and um, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Kaziz so he can introduce our last speaker.